For decades, we've talked about taking the politics out of health. But what if we actually need the politicians to step up to the challenge? Welcome to The View. Our health service moves from crisis to crisis on an almost daily basis, but with no functioning government, our elected representatives are absolved of all responsibility. Tonight, the MLAs who represent the five main political parties here on health are with me in the studio to set out how they would tackle the big challenges the sector is facing. Meantime, your chance to pass judgment on what they have to say for themselves is that bit further away now as Chris Heaton-Harris pushes the election deadline to next year. Our political editor, Enda McLafferty, is here with the latest. And with their thoughts on what we're discussing, I'm joined by Professor Deirdre Heenan and Newton Emerson. Hello, we'll come on to our debate with the politicians shortly, but let's just set the context for that discussion because we had quite a bit of political manoeuvring today between the local parties and the Secretary of State. Enda McLafferty is across what's been happening and he's with me now. And the five main parties were invited to the NIO's offices in Belfast today, and in fact, one issue in particular became a significant topic in that conversation, and it was a health issue.
Yes, the politicians obviously had a lot to talk to the Secretary of State today about, not least the protocol, the Stormont stalemate, and also, of course, the budget pressures, the fact that he now has to set a budget for next year. But you're right, there was one issue perhaps that focused minds more than most today, and that was the issue around so-called Daithí's law. Of course, this is the opt-out organ donation law, which has essentially been held up in Northern Ireland because we do not have an assembly or an executive in place to pass secondary legislation to ensure that this would pass into law and be put into effect. That's because, of course, the DUP's boycott of the executive. And it was interesting today to note that Chris Heaton-Harris arrived at those talks with some work prepared. He produced a letter to the political parties setting out how he believed this legislation could be passed through the Assembly in just one day. And he set out how it would involve the parties coming together after a recall petition and then setting down what he said was a statutory rule which would allow the Assembly essentially to vote through this secondary legislation, vote through the organ donation law and effectively do all that in one afternoon. So
there's now real pressure on the DUP on this issue. The other parties want to sort this issue at Stormont. They've been clear about that, but the DUP seems to want it done at Westminster.
Yes, the DUP is pretty clear in its mind that this can be done in Westminster. They've applied pressure there. They've had meetings with Sir Chris Heaton-Harris. They've also had meetings as well with Daithí McGowan's parents to talk about the prospect of this happening. It is also raised, I think, in a meeting between the Secretary of State and Daithí McGowan's parents as well. So they see that as the preferred route for that. And of course, they're going to push back in terms of what Chris Heaton-Harris is suggesting today, that this could be done via the Assembly, because that would involve the DUP coming off its boycott essentially to elect a Speaker to the Assembly. Now, there isn't any real sense, I think, that is going to happen. I don't think there's any appetite within the DUP to return to the Assembly in the absence of any overarching deal on the protocol, a deal which the party could essentially buy into. And I think there's every sense that this ultimately might end up back in Westminster.
Is the DUP feeling the heat at the moment?
Well, I think the DUP will feel the heat whenever this does reach the Assembly floor, because we know that Sinn Fein, for instance, have now tabled that recall petition. It requires 30 signatures. It's going to get that. Sinn Fein has 27 signatures as it sits already, and we're expecting the Assembly to be recalled perhaps in the middle of next week. And there's no doubt that will be an uncomfortable time for the DUP to have the focus on this particular issue, on Daithí's law, given, of course, the relationship that the former First Minister, Paul Givan, has built up with Daithí McGowan's families, the fact that Sir Geoffrey Donaldson has also had meetings with the family. There is a sense of loyalty, I suppose, there to try and do right by the family. And they're going to come under a lot of political pressure that day from the other parties to say, you know, we can do this today, we can make this happen today, if only you will support the election of a Speaker.
And we gather that the whips are going to meet at Stormont tomorrow to discuss when the recall is going to happen. It's pretty inevitable. I mean, I think you need 30 signatures. Sinn Féin doesn't have 30, but it's pretty close to 30, and the other parties support the idea. So there's really little doubt it's going to happen.
Yeah. Two important meetings, I would say, tomorrow, Mark. First of all, what's going to happen in Stormont, but also there's a meeting in Westminster as well with the Speaker there, Lindsay Hoyle, to discuss about this amendment, which is coming on the 22nd of February, the Executive Formation Bill, which paves the way, if you like, for things to roll out the way they are. And there is a sense that there could be an amendment laid down to that particular bill. Sir Geoffrey Donaldson is already saying he's going to table one, and that, in a sense, would allow this to go through Westminster. The difficulty around that is this piece of legend is pretty tightly defined, and it will be for the Speaker to decide if there is scope there for this particular amendment to be, in a sense, tagged on. Now, one of the MP told me tonight that there's a 30, maybe 40% chance this could happen, but I do think that if we reach a point whereby we get a recall of the Assembly next week, nothing changes, then this will go back to Westminster on the 22nd of February. And I do think there's every possibility that there will be a move to tag on this particular amendment, because I think the will there is among the Northern Ireland parties at Westminster. And I think Chris Heaton-Harris made it very clear today in the meeting with the parties that he would be prepared to go with them to try and convince the Speaker that this should happen.
Yeah, but the point is it would take longer that way. It would be the middle of March at the earliest.
Because the way that obviously would work, that would be the 22nd of February. We know that that piece of legislation will go through all the stages in the House of Commons at that point. It will then go to the House of Lords. That will not probably happen until sometime in the middle of March. And then, of course, it has to get royal assent and signed into the statute books. Also worth saying as well that this would essentially give Chris Heaton-Harris the power to lay the regulations for this to make it happen. So there is a process involved. So you're right, it could take up to towards the middle or end of March if it goes the Westminster route, but if it goes the Assembly Stormont route, this could all be done in a single afternoon. OK, and we'll leave it there for now. We'll talk to you again a bit later in the programme. Thank you. So the increasing pressures on our health service remain front and centre on the news agenda, as we've been saying. It's been a dire few months for many patients and those working on the front line. Here's a quick reminder.
The system is simply crammed with very sick, elderly, acutely ill men and women.
I mean, we still have no executive at Stormont. Rita Devlin there was asking who's in charge. Who is in charge?
It's a good question, isn't it?
Not only no minister, there's no executive, and there's no assembly.
Whoever's the next health minister has a huge challenge on their hands. But I think the groundwork was set through the Bangor report and through Michelle O'Neill's work then.
Whose fault is this?
It's our fault. It's politicians' fault. Partly the blame.
It's clearly it's not a good place to be, where we don't have, as I said, a minister, an assembly or an executive. If you look back over the last 5 or 6 years, we've had nearly a year now without an executive. Prior to that, COVID was pretty all-consuming, and then there were 3 years of no ministers prior to that as well.
About really the money anymore, to be honest with you. It's the conditions we're working in the wards. I've never seen morale so low in the 15 years of service.
We're just tired and we're all fed up now. A senior health official told me when the system is beyond broken, which the health service is, all people can be expected to do at this stage is to hunker down and to do the very best they can.
The trust should have come out, should have levelled with the public and should have said exactly what has been going on in relation to emergency general surgery from the start.
Well, let's hear from the politicians, and I'm joined around the table tonight by the MLAs from each of the main parties who have responsibility for health. Welcome to all of you, and thanks very much indeed for joining us on the programme tonight. Colin, Gildernew, we don't have a proper budget at the moment, and the parties didn't seem to bring any ideas on the subject to Chris Heaton-Harris's table today, despite being asked to. How is Northern Ireland meant to deliver an efficient health service on the budget we have when everything is hanging by a thread?
Well, I think in the first instance, it is welcome that my understanding is all of the parties today, in speaking to Chris Heaton-Harris, pressed upon him the impact that austerity has had over a long period of time, and that we need proper funding for public services. However,
pro rata, health funding in Northern Ireland is better than anywhere else in the United Kingdom, so it can't be a funding issue.
Well, we also include health and social care, and the entire health and social care system requires transformation, and indeed Ben Goa recognised that. Also, as I was saying, I do fundamentally believe that no single party here, given the scale of the issues that we are dealing with in health, No single party will be able to address the need for transformation in health. No single minister. Indeed, probably not even a single mandate. So this is a long-term project. But the crucial thing is, we absolutely need to be into an executive and an assembly to start that work.
OK, but your party actually halted that process of transformation when you brought Stormont down for 3 years. Your health minister, a certain Michelle O'Neill, back in October 2016, it was, brought Bengoa to the floor of the chamber. You said you were going to drive it through, and then shortly afterwards, Martin McGuinness pulled Stormont down. It didn't come back for 3 years.
Well, no coalition would have survived the scale of the RHA and the financial mismanagement that was inherent in that.
And so, you're interested in pushing an Irish language agenda as well. Let's not forget that.
Well, the reality of the situation is that we agreed a deal with the DUP within 11 months to restore that assembly and executive, which the DUP walked away from.
Yeah, but you can't sit and say transformation needs to happen and not take some responsibility for it not having happened. That's the point.
Well, we absolutely all need to take responsibility for how we are going to transform our health and social care system, and we absolutely need to work together to achieve that.
And when we have had an assembly and when we have had an executive, not very much was done about that.
Well, we have been dealing with a COVID crisis. We also need to ensure that all of the correct people are involved in the conversation. This will not be a top-down process. We need to ensure that clinical experts are involved, department are involved, staff who deliver health services are involved, and indeed, and key to all of this, communities are involved.
Yeah, and every time a health expert says we need to transform services in this particular area, local politicians say, no, you can't touch our services because they're precious to my constituents. You can go and change something else, but don't, for heaven's sake, touch my constituency. That's happened time and again over the last 6 years.
Well, once again, you're conflating what has happened in individual circumstances, despite the fact that in this very studio, both Mark Taylor and Alan Stout, co-authors of the Bengoa report, actually, both indicated that what happened in relation to that was not transformation, it was an unplanned collapse of a service. Just this week alone, Deirdre Heaney has actually indicated that the example of what happened in the South West Acute Hospital could serve as an example of how not to transform health.
Okay.
So that's the lesson we need to learn.
We'll be hearing from Professor Deirdre Heaney in due course, and I'll come back to you on some of those issues in a moment. Let me bring Paul Givan in. Do you think transformation's dead in the water at this stage?
No, it's absolutely essential. When you look at how society has changed over the past number of years, it's got bigger in terms of our population, but it's also got older, and the health service needs to evolve in terms of the delivery of its services. So it's critical that we do get transformation, and that requires a very dedicated focus around implementation, because there's enough reviews. We have those reviews there, and now we need to relentlessly implement a plan to do that, and the public need to see that bigger picture, and then they can buy into the process, because the unplanned collapse of services creates fear, and I understand that. But if people and the public can see the kind of health service that we want to deliver, and they can weigh up what's in their interests, then I think they will buy into a much more regionalised approach. We specialise our services in those purpose-built facilities, and we deliver other services across Northern Ireland. So we need to transform, we need to move from that acute hospital focus into primary and community care, and there's a huge piece of work that will take years to do, but we now need to get on with the implementation of that.
But can you seriously sit there with a straight face tonight and talk about relentless implementation? We know there are consultations going on which will ultimately need ministerial sign-off, but your party is stopping Stormont from sitting, an assembly and an executive sitting, to actually drive the relentless implementation that you want forward.
Well, we do need to have the implementation driven forward.
You're stopping it, that's the point.
Well, whether it's in the Assembly or whether it's with the Westminster Government taking on greater responsibility to deliver public services, this work needs to start. And the Secretary of State does need to take on more responsibility if he can't deliver the changes that are needed to get Stormont up and running. Public services shouldn't be held back in terms of their evolution.
But you think smashing the protocol is more important than relentlessly driving forward health reform?
I think dealing with the protocol so that we're not spending over 300 million so far,
which is disputed by a lot of people. But anyway, whatever it is, you think it's more important.
It's not disputed.
It is disputed.
It's not. Go and read the official answers to Gregory Campbell. We have
I think the people around this table would dispute it.
Well, they can dispute it.
Well, they do. That's the point. It is disputed.
Yes, people can have their own story, but they can't have their own facts. It's a fact. We're spending over 300 million on the Trusted Trader scheme in the first 2 years of its implementation. Is that not £300 million that should go into
OK,
our
well, it's a health
service?
discussion tonight. The point is that you think the protocol is more important than driving forward the reform you say needs to be relentlessly implemented, and you don't see a contradiction in that position.
Well, when I meet with medical practitioners and they say to me, we're really concerned about the movement of drugs across from Great Britain into Northern Ireland because of the implications of the protocol, I think everyone should be concerned about how that
and not having an
impact on
executive
health.
helps, does it?
Oh, I would much rather we have an executive.
You could have one next week.
I want to get an executive, and if we can get the barriers removed, then we'll have an executive next week. That responsibility lies with the UK government and the European Union.
No, it relies with the
place.
DUP, who've taken a political decision not to have Stormont working at the moment under the current circumstances, because you think that the issues of concern to you are more important than anybody else's issues, including health.
No, health is a top priority for the DUP.
It's not your top priority. The protocol is clearly your top priority.
Well, if you want to go back and talk about the protocol rather than health tonight, I'm quite happy to do that.
I'm just making the point. I'm making the point that for you, the protocol is more important. Otherwise, you'd be in government doing the job you're being paid to do.
You see, you're making it out as though it's protocol or health.
But it is protocol or health.
They're connected. I appreciate you don't understand that.
Well, no, it's not a question of not understanding. I mean, I don't try that line. I think we understand the reality. You've made a political decision, a calculation, that the protocol is more important, and that's why the other parties aren't able to be at Stormont, and why we don't have a health minister, and why you aren't sitting on a health committee.
No, well, we should have that. And New Decade, New Approach made commitments over 3 years ago. Over 3 years ago to deal with the very issues that have caused the collapse of this executive. And it hasn't been dealt with. OK, let's bring Paula Bradshaw in at this point and see if she agrees. I saw you rolling your eyes and shaking your head. So what do you make of Paul Givan's position that there isn't a contradiction between him having an issue, the DUP having an issue with the protocol, and wanting to drive forward health reform?
Well, we want to see the health transformation agenda delivered as soon as possible, and we are so frustrated, especially those of us who sat on the previous health committee. We know there is a list as long as your arm of things that need to be addressed, and it is really unfortunate that we haven't been able to give the political leadership to the Department of Health to deliver on the radical reform that is needed in our health service. We have demonstrated after the 3 years, as you say, that Sinn Fein kept us down, but we had a period there during the COVID pandemic when we were able to work very collectively and set political differences aside to work on a wide range of bills and other pieces of secondary legislation to come together to deliver for the people of Northern Ireland. And unfortunately, we've now had another year of impasse, and the list of issues that we have to deal with is growing.
So where are we with transformation at the moment? I mean, would you like to see Peter May and his officials in the Department of Health pushing ahead with that agenda while Stormont remains in hiatus? Is that the only option on the table at the moment?
Well, we continue to meet with the Permanent Secretary on a regular basis, and at our most recent meeting we were presented with a draft copy of the hospital reconfiguration design plan, and there are no real great surprises on that. In that it's really looking at elective care and acute care at the minute. But what we would like to see is that populated with information around where the regional specialism centres are going to be, because it is only whenever we create those that we develop robust, competent teams to be driving down the waiting lists, like endometriosis, neurology, rapid diagnostic centres.
We're not doing that at the moment.
No,
I mean, the waiting lists aren't getting shorter.
No, well, I think that there are areas that the waiting lists are coming down, that the elective care framework has been up and running now for a year and a half, and we are seeing some waiting lists being tackled, and that's only because they're being delivered on a regional approach. But I agree with you, it is far from perfect, and I think it does a disservice to our civil servants, like the Permanent Secretary, to ask them to take political decisions. That is on us. We asked for a mandate, we got it last May, and we have been unable to deliver on it since.
Can I ask you this question? Would Alliance pick health under de Hont if it was still available when your turn came around? Would you like to be the health minister?
Well, I'm not sure I would be the health minister. It'll be up to the leader to decide who takes it on. But we produced proposals a year ago around how we would drive forward the transformation in going a step further.
So Alliance wouldn't run away from it?
We certainly would not. And a few months ago, we then updated that to look at the winter pressure. So we have loads of ideas of what we need to do, not just within the hospital setting, but we also recognise that there are huge inequalities across society. And if we are going to look at population health in its entirety, then we're going to have to get into communities and deal with some of the issues around education, prevention, early detection, so that we don't have a health service collapse in the future. So we have loads of ideas of what we need to do to turn this ship around.
Okay.
But we need the executive back up and running. And very importantly, we need a 3-year budget, because if we're going to get the brightest and best into these regional specialism centres, we're going to have to give them more than 1-year contract. We're going to have to give them 3 years security of tenure, because we need the best people in there to drive health excellence and drive the innovation that's needed to give the best patient outcomes, patient safety for the people that we represent.
OK, Alan Chambers, Robin Swan, your party colleague, was widely praised, I think it's fair to say, for his handling of COVID during the pandemic. He's the politician in all probability with the most detailed knowledge of the health service in Northern Ireland at the moment. Where's he been since he left office in October?
Robin has been working internally within the party. We have been working on manifesto issues. We've been working on papers to address a lot of the issues that are facing the health service at the moment. So Robin certainly isn't hiding from anyone.
Well, he's not doing too many interviews.
He's out there. He's working for his constituents. He's no longer a minister. He's just like the rest of us here. He's an MLA.
Well, no, he's not just like the rest of us. He's a former health minister during a very difficult period who got a lot of credit for the hard work that he did and for the difficult portfolio that he did have to deal with. It's just interesting he doesn't seem to want to engage in that public debate. On behalf, maybe, of the department, as a proxy maybe for the department, as somebody who has an understanding, and indeed on behalf of the Ulster Unionist Party. You don't think that's strange, no?
No, I don't. I think he's left a very good foundation.
But has he? Because it's a terrible mess at the moment, and he was the last person sitting at that desk, I'm afraid to say.
Well, go back to an earlier question there about you're asking would certain parties take on the portfolio of health. Our party took it on in 2020.
Would you take it on again?
When everybody ran away from it? Yes, we would.
You would?
We would.
Would you like to be health minister?
I think it's a too onerous job for me, but
well, you're the health spokesperson for the party. That's a pretty onerous job.
I would like to see Robin Swan back in post. Right. Robin Swan proved himself, I think, to be a very popular health minister. Certainly, all the polls showed that he had the most respect of all the ministers in the executive.
Yeah. Which kind of brings me back to my first point. Where is he? Where's he been since October?
Well, the guy, he had a very, very tough job over the last 3 years. And as I say, he's out there working as an MLA.
Why did he not push harder on the transformation agenda, do you think?
Well, he did push hard. I mean, he delivered quite a bit of transformation. Unfortunately, a lot of it has now fallen by the wayside because we don't have an executive and because we don't have a recurring budget. But Robin did deliver a lot of, I mean, he set up the diagnostic centres, a couple of those, and people that were waiting for new hips, new knees have now got that treatment.
Yeah, well, we've had some transformation, but not wholesale transformation.
Well, he's done what he can, and bearing in mind that we had the 2 years of the pandemic. It wasn't an easy time. Robin and the health department had to really focus on that. We were dealing with an unknown quantity in the COVID epidemic.
Okay.
So.
Let me bring in Colin McGrath from the SDLP. Your former Assembly Party colleague Karen McKevitt, you will know, recently experienced the pressure the health service is under at first hand just a few weeks ago. She was critical of politicians for not finding solutions. Do you agree with her? Did she have a point?
Well, absolutely. And I mean, if we look back over the last decade, we haven't seen the political leadership that we need to see in order to bring in that transformation. That's why we're in the mess that we're in. There have been countless opportunities over the last decade to deliver on transformation. We haven't seen that, but there has been a cut to the budgets. There's been cuts to training places for surgeons. There's been cut to GP training places. And guess what? We're now looking at no GP, or a lack of GPs and a lack of surgeons.
Yeah, so but listen, it's a damning indictment of politicians from a former politician. She said, and I quote, "Politics should be taken out of health because people are dying. It's our fault, the politicians' fault. We are partly to blame."
Well, I think we couldn't but say that. Where we are today, and we have had government over the last 10 years. It's been stop, it's been go. We've had the COVID pandemic, but we haven't taken the decisions that need to be taken. But all of that is in the past. What we need to do now is look to the future and see if we can get that transformation in place. We can't do that if we don't have an executive and we don't have an assembly.
Well, Paul Givan says you can, because it could be driven forward, for example, by Westminster. Is he right?
No, we need to see local politicians taking those decisions, because where in the past people are afraid of taking decisions.
Well, you had a chance to take those decisions. You didn't take them.
Well, we haven't had the opportunity for... I mean, I've been in the Assembly from 2016. It was down for 3 years. We had COVID pandemic for 2 years, and it's been down for the last year. I'm here 6 years wanting to try and deliver on that agenda, but don't get the opportunity. But I'm confident that we will get the opportunity, because I believe that the parties do actually want to work together to deliver that. We just need to get the Assembly and the Executive up and running. Okay. That's down to the DUP.
Right. So do you accept the basic principles of Bengoa locating services at the point of most need? And are you clear that if that principle conflicts with maybe the interests of your constituents who don't like some of the plans that are brought forward, you will back the health professionals who say, no, this is a better way to do it, even if people feel they're losing out on the ground?
Well, first of all, I think all politicians are now moving in that direction.
Well, are they? Because not everybody in the SDLP is. There are some members of the SDLP who are absolutely not moving in that direction.
And we shouldn't confuse issues. You're talking about a collapse of a service and a response to that. I'm talking about transformation and going forward. The parties have committed themselves to doing that, but we've also, through our meetings with the Health Minister previously and through the work with Peter May, have established that principle that no area should lose out of transformation. It may mean reconfiguration, but it doesn't mean a loss of services. And I think that type of principle is really positive, because it allows all of the politicians to get in behind the process, to work with the specialists to be able to deliver the care across the north that everybody needs to see.
OK, let's move on to talk about Daithí's Law. Enda mentioned it in our conversation earlier. Paul Givan, you were happy to support this proposed change to the system of organ donation a year ago when you were First Minister. We saw pictures of you with Daithí and his family. There's an opportunity to see it through at Stormont as soon as next week, as Enda said, and the other parties around the table tonight support that, but the DUP wants it to go through Westminster, which would take longer. Why?
So I have got to know Daithí and his parents, Marcin and Seth, from the time when I was First Minister, and he did make a powerful impact upon me, and I referenced it even in my resignation, the impact that he made, because politics is about trying to make a difference to people like Daithí. And the legislation, which had been stuck for a number of years, actually, was unlocked following all of that engagement.
Right, so why do you want to push it through Westminster, which will take longer, rather than Stormont, which could be done in a day next week?
And we passed the primary legislation through Stormont, and it was a good example where politicians and the Assembly can work effectively together.
It's still not in the statute books.
No, we need the regulation in order to deal with an implementation of the bill in a particular area. I regret that the Secretary of State, one, didn't bring forward a bill to Westminster which included this, and now it has to be brought forward by an amendment, which Sir Geoffrey Donaldson has said that he will do, and the Secretary of State has indicated today he will support representation to the Speaker. That shouldn't be necessary. It should have been in the bill.
But it could be done more quickly at Stormont. Why will you not support that route? It could be done next week.
Well, this issue, along with a plethora of other issues, are going to come to light in terms of its impact on society in the absence of the Assembly. And I think the Secretary of State should be taking a much wider enabling power to allow him to legislate on areas. Because if we don't get the barriers removed that is preventing the Assembly and the Executive coming back, this issue, along with others, is going to require passing the action. No, it's called making sure the public don't pay the price for the failure of politics in Northern Ireland.
But the public are paying a price for the DUP's decision not to go back into Stormont, not to do the job you're being paid to do, and not to go down the quicker route of Stormont next week rather than Westminster by the middle or end of March. Well, you won't address that issue, and I'm just asking you, why not? People are watching the programme, they know the facts, they've heard Enda explain them. Why are you going for a route that's going to take longer if you care so much about Daithí and Daithí's Law rather than get the matter dealt with quickly?
Well, the arguments are now well rehearsed in terms of why we don't have a functioning Assembly and Executive. And Daithí's family haven't sought to play politics with this issue around Stormont.
Do you think the other parties are playing politics with it?
Well, undoubtedly they're trying to put pressure in terms of the party's position.
Do you think the DUP is playing politics with health?
No, I think we've made our position now clear over the past year.
Do you think the DUP is playing politics with health?
No, I don't. And again, we can rehearse the arguments as to how we've got here. I only wish other parties hadn't ignored the warnings that were given by the DUP for a number of years.
They didn't. The warnings about Brexit.
Listen. And so we are now in the position that we are, and I don't think anyone in the public should pay the price for the failure of politics in Northern Ireland.
Okay, Colin,
and the Secretary of State should take on much greater responsibility, not just on this issue, but on other issues.
Well, let me put that to Colin Gildernew. Why is Sinn Féin playing politics with health, in particular Dahi's law, by seeking to bring an issue to a head which doesn't need to be dealt with in this fashion, says Paul Givan?
Well, one of the first meetings, actually the second meeting that I did as chair of the Health Committee, was with Paul's colleague Pam Cameron, with Dahi and Seth and Marcin. And we committed that we would do everything in our power to get that legislation over the line. And we carried out and delivered on that commitment. And people have seen all of us work together on health. And that is what people want to see us doing again. The difficulty with Paul's argument is time is not on the side of many people out there who are waiting for transplants. Time is crucial. And I think it's particularly cruel to sit here tonight and to say we'll go for Plan B, which will take longer because that protects our political position. We will be taking a recall motion forward, and I would ask all the parties here to work with us.
Well, the other parties are going to work with you, but it doesn't sound like the DUP is going to work with you.
Well, I would ask the DUP to reconsider that.
OK, well, let me just speak, because I actually haven't heard anyone from the DUP categorically say that you wouldn't support the Sinn Féin move next week. Can you now clarify for us, are you saying the DUP will not support the appointment of a Speaker at Stormont next week? Can you categorically clarify that?
Well, we shouldn't be in this position because the Secretary of State should have brought forward
just answer the question,
legislation.
It's a simple question.
The party will take a view on the approach.
So it's a possibility, is it?
I haven't engaged with Sir Geoffrey on that particular issue.
Seriously, you've come on to a television programme tonight. You knew you were going to be asked about this issue, and you didn't think to ring anybody in the party and ask them what the party position might be and if it might change.
The party will meet, and we'll be meeting first.
When is the party going to meet?
We'll be having a group meeting on Monday morning, and we'll take a position as to the approach that we'll take.
And you're very passionate about this. You've said you're passionate about this. Will you be making the case that maybe the DUP should reconsider?
I want the Assembly up and running. I didn't want the Assembly to collapse. Others goaded Jeffrey Donaldson to collapse the Executive rather than work through the issues.
So you're uncomfortable with this strategy?
So I want the Assembly to
get up and running. Are you uncomfortable with this strategy? Would you like the DUP to change its position? Is that what you're saying?
I'm entirely uncomfortable with us not having Stormont up and running, but I know the reasons why it's not there. And because we don't have that delicate balance that we need based upon the Belfast Agreement in place, and that's what needs to be restored in order for the Assembly and the Executive to get up and running.
OK, well, that's very interesting. I just want to ask you, before I hear from the others, what is the DUP's message directly to Dahi's family tonight? What's the message to the 100 people on the waiting list today for an organ transplant? Is it simply that the DUP's concerns about the protocol are more important than your concerns about getting that life-saving surgery?
Well, I encourage people to put their names on the register, as I do. I want this legislation to be given effect. Our party's working towards that. We've met with the family. Sir Geoffrey has met with the family. He's going to bring forward an amendment. The Secretary of State has indicated that he is going to support that. The broader point that I'm making, that it's not just on this case. There will be other issues that require legislation to be put in place.
Yeah.
And we know...
No, you've said that, but the point is your precious position on the protocol trumps everything else. I mean, that's it in a nutshell, isn't it?
No, it isn't. That isn't
how is
the case.
it not?
Because the protocol impacts on how the Assembly and the Executive functions.
Right, OK. Paula, what do you make of what you've just heard, the debate between the DUP and Sinn Féin and how this might be moved forward? Just briefly.
Well, first of all, I think we as a party will be signing the recall motion, but we are deeply uncomfortable with the politics that's being played around this issue. As you say, it's not just the McGowan family, it is the 100 other families who are waiting on that phone call around a match for organ donation, and it is just deeply regrettable that we are in this position on this issue.
So is your plea to Paul Givan to try to get his party colleagues to change tack?
Absolutely. Now, my colleague Stephen Farry in Westminster, he will remain solution focused to try and see about getting the amendment over the line. But we know that the scope of the bill in Westminster is too tight, and the place that these regulations should be laid and approved is in the Assembly.
OK. That's not going to happen, Colin McGrath, is it? It's pretty clear, at least if I'm reading the room correctly, it doesn't look as if that's going to happen. It's going to be Westminster.
It probably will be, because, I mean, if we look back at the actual legislation, it was politics at its best. The 5 parties came together, we worked hard, we delivered the legislation that was needed. But what we're actually seeing now from the DUP is politics at its worst, where they will actually take a principled position over saving people's lives. I think people should think long and hard about that they're actually prepared to take a principled political position. They'd rather that people run the risk of losing their lives. We want to see the legislation in, and the SDLP MPs will do whatever is required in Westminster, but this could be done next week.
Alan Chambers, you are a unionist. You don't like the protocol, just like Paul Givan, but do you think his party's got its tactics wrong on this?
The reason why the Health Minister, Robin Swan, was so popular was that when Robin left his home every morning to carry out his ministerial duties, he left his personal politics at the front door. And he didn't bring that into his duties. We haven't just supported the organ donation legislation. We championed it. Joanne Dobson brought this legislation forward in 2016, and it was knocked back for political reasons. And Robin Swan, over the last year, did try very hard to push this legislation over the line.
So would you like to see it, just very quick, would you like to see it dealt with quickly at Stormont next week?
Absolutely. I mean, there's people watching this programme tonight who are going to lose hope of getting a transplant because of this delay. Whatever is required, the Ulster Unionist Party will put their shoulder to the wheel to get this done as quickly as possible.
OK, we need to leave it there, folks. I wish we had more time, but we've covered quite a lot of ground in the time that we have had. Thank you all very much indeed for coming in to join us. Let's get some analysis of what we've just heard from Professor Deirdre Heenan and Newton Emerson. There goes